If there's been one consistent complaint from Marvel Comics fans for the last, I don't know, year or two, it's why does Spider-Man suck so bad? Amazing Spider-Man just is absolutely terrible. In fact, Marvel went so far as to promise that they were going to deliver a comic book that you and I would absolutely hate, being Spider-Man fans. It turns out it was the death of Miss Marvel and nobody really hated it or whatever. A couple of screeching harpies on social medias, but for the most part, no one really cared. No one batted an eye, but I guess the sales are still good on that one. So they're going to their next great idea. They're making a sequel to the most notorious Spider-Man comic book story ever told. And when you hear that, there's only 3 stories that really come to mind. Sins Past, which is absolutely terrible, retcons Gwen Stacy into having a relationship with Norman Osborn, which is absolutely gross, and ends up having some kids or whatever. One More Day, where basically they poof the Spider-Man MJ marriage out of existence, and everyone's been begging for that one to come back for some time. And then Spider-Man Reign. I do have the details on which one of these notorious books is getting a sequel, and we're going to talk about why this has happened. Marvel Comics has released a teaser for what appears to be a sequel to Spider-Man Reign, calling it the most notorious Spider-Man story ever told. Spider-Man Reign was published in 2006, and in the teaser image, a 2 can easily be read along with the art that mimics now iconic art from Spider-Man Reign. The now infamous miniseries by Carrie Andrews featured the death of Mary Jane, who, spoilers, died of cancer brought on by exposure to Peter's radioactive semen during intercourse over the years. This detail is, of course, not what the entire series is about, but it's certainly a sticking point as far as the fans who dislike the story. That's right, folks. Radioactive spider jizz is back on the menu. We're getting a sequel to Spider-Man Reign, a story that never really needed to be told in the first place. I like Carrie Andrews, and I like a lot of what he's done over the years, specifically with Spider-Man, and now he's got Erratic, which is basically a Spider-Man character, but in another universe. But Spider-Man Reign is not the high point of Carrie Andrews' existence as a comic book creator. Spider-Man Reign is nowhere near the apex of Spider-Man as a character, and Spider-Man Reign is something that Marvel Comics probably should be more ashamed of than anything else, but apparently they're going to celebrate it. We're going to get a sequel to the story that introduced Peter Parker killed his wife, Mary Jane, because his semen was radioactive. If you remember, Spider-Man Reign is supposed to be basically The Dark Knight Returns, but for Spider-Man. Spider-Man has been retired. It's 30 years in the future. We find out that he lost Mary Jane because his semen is radioactive, and he's called back into action, and it basically sets up a new timeline or future for the character. And I imagine Marvel Comics and Carrie Andrews were hoping that this would create its own universe, kind of like The Dark Knight Returns did, but it didn't because of the radioactive spider semen part of the story. People just couldn't get over it, and you can't really blame them. Obviously, that's not exactly the most original idea either. That's a pretty big plot point in Alan Moore's The Watchmen. But in that story, Dr. Manhattan didn't actually kill his girlfriend or give her cancer. It was a ruse. It was actually meant to disarm him so maybe people could take advantage of him later. It obviously didn't work out. And obviously The Watchmen has a very different tenor and tone just to begin with than Marvel Comics itself. And certainly a Spider-Man comic book that actually people would want to enjoy. So we're going back to Spider-Man Reign, a story that no one liked to begin with. A story that probably never really needed to be told to go and celebrate something that no one really even likes. But this is where Marvel Comics are. The only kind of buzz they can get now is like, hey, we're going to tell a story in Spider-Man. We're going to have an issue that you hate to your bones. That's what we're going to deliver you. And now we're going to deliver you a sequel to one of the most hated stories in Spider-Man history, one of the most hated stories in Marvel history, one of the most hated stories in comic book history. And that's where we are with Marvel Comics. Now, why is this happening? This is all very clear. They actually have no new stories to tell. So they're just mining the old stuff. They've kind of mined through the stuff that they already could regurgitate, and now they're onto the stuff that if anyone had their faculties, they would never actually reconsider delving back into or revisiting or any of that stuff, but that's kind of where we are now. Just a few days ago, I did talk about Tom Brevoort. There's something going on with him at Marvel Comics, and I end up having to go over and read his newsletter. I believe it's on Substack, but I don't really know. I just hit the link on the article that I was reading at the time, and he actually had some really interesting information on Spider-Man, and in my opinion, a couple of reasons why this is actually happening, and I kind of would encourage you guys to go out there and check out Tom Brevoort's newsletter. As far as newsletters go, he provides a lot more interesting information than almost anybody else in comic books does. It was actually kind of weird. In one of the questions that he was responding to, people were complaining that Zeb Wells' Amazing Spider-Man run absolutely sucks, which it does. And this was the answer from Senior Vice President, Executive Editor, likely moving on to a bigger job in the very near future, Tom Brevoort. All of those Spider-Man fans upset about recent storylines. Lots of people are complaining and telling us that everybody hates the book and the direction and Zeb Wells and Nick Lowe. I can't argue with that last one. But month after month, it continues to be our best-selling regular title. So given that, which should we pay heed to? The irate yelling or the cash in the registers? So what Tom Brevoort is saying there is, people say it's not very good and they don't like it, but They haven't stopped buying it. Now, I would challenge that. It might be your best-selling title today, but based on numbers even 5 years ago, would this Amazing Spider-Man run be your best-selling book? How about 10 years ago? Would it even be in the top 5 at that point? Would it even be in the top 10? Because I think Marvel has kind of failed across the board. And while people are still buying Marvel comics more than DC, despite DC having some better comic book titles right now, a lot of that is based on variant cover schemes and speculators and a whole lot of collectors that have complete runs that aren't even really reading the book anymore. In fact, I know Spider-Man fans that have been buying the title for 40 years that actually decided to give it up recently, because there are people that are absolutely fed up with it. But he does make a point. If people refuse to stop buying the book, even though it absolutely sucks balls, why should they change? What should they do differently if it's still going to be their best-selling book, no matter if it's good or it's bad? You and I both know it sucks ass. Tom Brevoort knows that it sucks ass. CB Cebulski knows that this current run of Spider-Man absolutely sucks ass. But they don't need to make a change, because based on the sales of it, in comparison to everything happening right now, it's still a good selling title. Now, I don't think it would be doing so well if you compare it to 5 or 10 years ago, because I think they've run enough Marvel fans and Spider-Man fans off at this point. But the people that are sticking with it are buying it, and I imagine a lot of them aren't reading it because it does suck. He also talks about something else that was very interesting. People had complaints about Zeb Wells' run, that there had been large-scale changes to it because there were a lot of cliffhangers or surprises that were teased before it even really started. That everyone hated Peter Parker. There was this big explosion, I believe, in Pennsylvania, and everyone had turned on him. NJ wouldn't speak to him. You know, these were the big mysteries that we were supposed to be paid off. And at this point, they kind of have been paid off, but it turned out they weren't really a big deal. And someone said, why do you keep changing whatever the story was that Zeb Wells was going to tell? This is what Tom Brevoort said. I can tell you that the story you got in those recent issues is materially the same story that Zeb outlined to Marvel Creative and the editorial staff when he began working on the book. So whatever course corrections you're seeing are perhaps larger in your mind than they are in reality. I feel that if you just consider all this from the perspective that Nick Lowe is a goon, it becomes a lot easier to realize that what you're reacting to isn't malice or course correction. It's simply incompetent bungling. So Zeb Wells has been on Amazing Spider-Man going on almost 2 years now. It's definitely well over a year. Obviously, he had to pitch this beforehand, and this is the story, the really bad one that we're reading right now, besides the Tombstone stuff, which was admittedly cool. That was the story that he pitched. These are all the events that were supposed to happen, and this is what Tom Brevoort, Nick Lowe, CB Cebulski all greenlit for the book. They can't identify what a good story looks like anymore. They just don't have the talent, the ability, or the give a fucktitude to actually look at the story and be like, is this something Spider-Man fans actually want to read? Is this something that's going to resonate with our customers or any of that stuff? They got pitched what we're reading right now, and it absolutely sucks, and they didn't care. Now, the last point, you might have noticed that Tom Brevoort was taking the piss from Spider-Man group editor Nick Lowe a couple of times in the first answer and then again in the second answer, basically saying that he was incompetent. Now, it's clear that Tom Brevoort is trying to make fun of what is probably a good friend of his. But I remember seeing a documentary on Disney Plus where he was making fun of another good friend of his, Dan Slott. And basically all the stuff that he was making fun of him for was materially true. So there's probably a really good chance that behind the scenes, Nick Lowe is really stupid. And Tom Brevoort knows that, and CB Cebulski know that. But maybe they just can't hire anybody better that's more qualified. So you have people that are really incompetent in positions that are kind of vital and key and integral to Marvel Comics operations, and certainly for Spider-Man. And none of them can tell what a good story is. And a lot of them, as Tom Brevoort has pointed out, are pretty incompetent to begin with anyway. So what can you expect? Yes, you're going to get a sequel to Spider-Man Reign. We're likely to get a sequel to a lot of other stuff that nobody ever wanted to revisit again because they have no new ideas. They run through all the stuff that was successful before, ran that into the ground to where people don't like that anymore. And now we're having to regurgitate the stuff that everyone wanted to be left in the waste pile years and years ago. Yes, radioactive spider jizz is back on the menu because Marvel Comics just can't help themselves. They're just not very good right now. In fact, incompetence seems to be kind of the modus operandi for Marvel Comics these days. You are not the only ones that are noticing this. I'm not the only one that's noticing this. A lot of retailers are speaking out lately about the quality of Marvel Comics and the fact that people really aren't buying the comic books as much as they were even 5 or 10 years ago. Recently, there was a comic book retailer that absolutely put Marvel to shame, calling them out for all their BS. If you haven't seen this video, definitely check it out right now. There's also a link in the video description.